The morning Caroline Boone walked up the courthouse steps in Harlan County, Texas, with nothing but the clothes on her back and the truth in her heart. The whole town held its breath to see if that would be enough to save her. It was the autumn of 1882, and the dust of Caldwell Creek sat thick on everything it touched, on the windowsills of the general store, on the brims of men's hats, on the graves of the newly buried out past the East Ridge. Caroline had buried her husband, Thomas Boone, just 6 weeks prior, laid him in that red clay earth with her own hands trembling, and her 2 children pressed against her skirts. Thomas had died of fever, fast and merciless the way the land itself could be, leaving behind a homestead of 40 acres, a half-built barn, a mule named Chester, and a debt to a man named Earl Whitmore that was about to swallow everything Caroline had left. She was 28 years old. She had calloused hands, dark circles under green eyes that had once been full of laughter, and a quiet kind of dignity that sat on her shoulders like a second skin. She had not come to Caldwell Creek looking for a fight. She had come to this town 7 years ago as a bride, hopeful and young, believing in the promise of a new life in the open territory. Thomas had been a good man, a hard-working man, but he had borrowed money from Earl Whitmore when the drought took 2 seasons of crops, and the terms of that loan, the terms that Whitmore now claimed gave him the right to seize the homestead entirely, were something Caroline had never fully understood until a deputy showed up at her door with a notice folded into thirds. The notice said she had 10 days to vacate. The notice said the property belonged to Earl Whitmore by the terms of the loan agreement dated March of 1880. The notice said she had no legal standing to contest it. Caroline read it 3 times. Then she folded it back into thirds, set it on the kitchen table, and looked out the window at the land she and Thomas had broken their bodies working. She thought about her son, Daniel, who was 7 years old and had his father's same straight nose and his mother's stubbornness. She thought about her daughter, Me, who was 5 and had taken to sleeping with her arms wrapped around Chester the mule's neck in the mornings, because she said it made her feel less afraid. Caroline went to the courthouse. She did not have a lawyer. She could not afford a lawyer. What she had was a memory like iron, and a set of papers that Thomas had kept in a tobacco tin beneath the floorboards of the bedroom papers that included the original loan agreement, a partial repayment receipt from the summer of 1881, and a letter Thomas had written to Whitmore disputing the interest terms that had been added without consent. She had those papers, and she had the truth, and she walked into Caldwell Creek with her chin level and her jaw set. The courthouse was a 2-story building made of limestone that had been hauled in from the quarry 20 miles east. It smelled of old paper and wood polish, and the kind of authority that small-town men like to wrap around themselves like a good coat. The land registrar's office was on the ground floor, and the hearing room was upstairs, where the circuit judge, a man named Hollis Crane, would arrive every 3rd week to preside over whatever legal matters had accumulated in Caldwell Creek in his absence. Judge Crane was due in 2 days. Caroline had gotten word through the minister's wife, a kind-hearted woman named Helen Prout, that Earl Whitmore had already spoken to half the county commissioners and had paid for a lawyer to come down from San Angelo. His lawyer's name was Beaumont, and he was known throughout that stretch of Texas as a man who could make paper say whatever his client needed it to say. Caroline stood on the courthouse steps that Monday morning with her tobacco tin tucked under her arm and her papers in order, waiting for the registrar to open the office so she could formally file her objection before Whitmore's claim could be processed unchallenged. She had arrived at 7 in the morning. It was now past 8. The registrar, a man named Poole, had walked past her twice without looking at her directly, which told her everything she needed to know about where his sympathies lay. She had been standing there long enough for the autumn sun to shift its angle and begin warming the stone beneath her feet when she heard boots on the steps behind her. He came up the courthouse, stairs the way a man moved when he wasn't trying to prove anything, easy and unhurried, like a man who had covered a great deal of ground in his life, and had stopped being impressed by the effort of it. He was tall, broad through the shoulders in a way that spoke of real work rather than show, and he wore a faded blue shirt, worn leather vest, and a hat that had been to more places than most men in Caldwell Creek would ever see. His jaw was dark with several days' worth of beard, and his eyes, when they found hers, were the color of weathered oak, brown and steady and carrying something honest in them that Caroline had not expected from a stranger. He looked at her. He looked at the courthouse door. He looked at the tin under her arm and at the set of her shoulders and at the careful way she was holding herself together. He was perceptive in the particular way that men who spent long stretches of time alone became perceptive reading a landscape the way other men read words. "Office still closed?" he asked. "For me it is," Caroline said, not bitterly, just plainly. He tilted his head slightly, taking that in. "Earl Whitmore's doing," she looked at him directly then. "You know the situation. I rode in last night," he said. "Stopped at the boarding house on Maple Street. Mrs. Prout runs it now. She mentioned a widow out on the Boone homestead was coming in today to fight a claim." He paused. "She mentioned it because she was worried about you." Caroline absorbed that. "Mrs. Prout worries about everyone." "She does," he agreed. "But she doesn't send notes around to every man at her supper table asking them to keep an eye out." He reached into his vest pocket and produced a small folded note, which he held out to her without making a performance of it. "She asked me to come." Caroline took the note. It was in Helen Prout's handwriting, round and careful. It said, "She is good and honest and she deserves someone in her corner. Please, Mr. Slater." She looked up at him. "Graham Slater," he said before she could ask. "I do range work mostly. Come through this way twice a year or so. I've known Mrs. Prout since she was teaching school in Abilene." Caroline handed the note back. "I appreciate it, but I don't need someone to stand beside me and look threatening. I have my papers in order and I intend to make my case to the judge properly." "I know," Graham said, and he said it without patronizing her, which she noticed. "I'm not here to be threatening. I'm just here to stand beside you, if that's all right." She studied him for a moment longer than was strictly polite. He did not flinch from it or fill the silence with nervous words. He simply waited. "Mr. Slater," she said finally, "do you have any business at this courthouse today?" "I do now," he said simply, and stepped up to stand beside her on the top step, facing the door. Something in Caroline's chest shifted slightly, the way a door shifts on a long unused hinge, reluctant and surprised and not yet fully open, but moving. They waited together. At 8:30, Poole finally unlocked the office door, and Caroline walked in with Graham one step behind her. Poole, a thin man with ink-stained fingers and the habit of looking at the ceiling when he was uncomfortable, tried to tell Caroline that the registrar's log for contested claims was full for the current week and that she would need to return on Thursday. "Thursday is after the hearing," Caroline said. "That may be," Poole said. "If my objection isn't filed before the hearing, the judge won't have it before him. You know that, Mr. Poole." "The rules of the office. Show me the rule in writing," Caroline said. "The rule that says the log is full. Show it to me." Poole looked at the ceiling. Graham leaned forward, not touching anything, not raising his voice, just making his presence known in the way that a large and quietly composed man could do without effort. "It would be a shame," he said pleasantly, "if there was a reason to bring the matter of filing procedure before the judge himself. I expect he'd want to know why a properly submitted objection was turned away on a technicality." Poole got out the log. Caroline filed her objection. She paid the filing fee from a small coin purse she kept tucked inside her boot, and she walked out of the courthouse with her receipt in her hand and the tobacco tin still under her arm, and for the first time in weeks, something in her felt just slightly less like she was standing at the edge of a cliff. She turned to Graham on the steps. "Thank you," she said. "Poole was always a coward," Graham said. "Whitmore pays him to be one. Doesn't make it harder to work around. You know a good deal about this town for someone passing through." "I've been passing through for 8 years," Graham said. "You pick things up." She almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was close enough that he noticed it, and filed it away in the back of his mind like something worth returning to. He fell into step beside her as she walked down the courthouse steps and onto the main street of Caldwell Creek, and neither of them spoke about whether he was accompanying her or whether it was just coincidence that they were headed in the same direction. They passed the dry goods store, the blacksmith's, and the barber shop, and a number of townspeople watched them with the intense, focused attention of people who had very little entertainment in their daily lives. "I need to speak to someone about the interest clause in Thomas's loan agreement," Caroline said, not looking at Graham but clearly addressing him. "The rate was set at 6%. Whitmore is claiming it was set at 12 and that the difference constitutes default. Do you have the original agreement? I have Thomas's copy. Whitmore will have his. I expect his will say 12. Graham was quiet for a moment. "You think he changed it?" "I know he changed it," Caroline said. "Thomas was not a careless man. He wrote down everything. He kept every receipt." She pressed the tin a little tighter under her arm. "But knowing it and proving it to a judge are two different things." "They are," Graham agreed. He had been in Caldwell Creek on and off for years, doing contract work for various ranchers in the area, breaking horses, driving cattle, mending fence line, the work that followed the seasons and kept a man fed and moving. He was 32 years old and had been on his own since he was 16, and he had accumulated a particular kind of wisdom that came from paying close attention to people and places, and the way the two shaped each other. He had learned early that the West was a place where a man with money and connections could make the law bend like a green branch, and he had never much liked it. He had taken one look at Caroline Boone on those courthouse steps, the careful composure of her, the way she held herself against the world's indifference, and something in him had snapped to attention in a way it hadn't done in a long time. He was not the kind of man who made a habit of inserting himself into other people's troubles. But Mrs. Pruitt's note had said please, and he had come, and now that he was here, he had no intention of going anywhere until the matter was settled. That afternoon, he went to see a man named Gus Farrow, who had been a land surveyor in Caldwell Creek for 15 years and who had a long memory for dealings in the county. Gus was 70 years old, hard of hearing and deeply suspicious of everyone who wasn't Gus Farrow, but he had known Thomas Boone and had been at the signing of more than one loan agreement in Earl Whitmore's presence over the years. Graham found Gus in his back room, surrounded by rolled maps and the smell of tobacco and dust, and sat down across from him and explained the situation. Gus listened. He chewed on his pipe. He said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "Whitmore added terms to two other agreements I know of. One fellow paid the difference to keep his land. The other one lost everything and moved his family to San Antonio." "Would you testify to that?" Graham asked. Gus looked at him a long time. "Whitmore's got friends in this county." "He does," Graham said. "I'm 70 years old," Gus said. "I'm not going to live forever. Maybe it's time I said a few things I've been keeping quiet." He took the pipe out of his mouth and looked at it. "You bring me something in writing from that widow about what she needs, and I'll come to the hearing." Graham walked back to the boarding house with something that felt like the beginning of a plan. He found Caroline in the small sitting room that Mrs. Pruitt kept for her boarders, with Daniel on one side of her and me on the other, both children leaning into her like small, warm anchors. The children looked up at Graham with a frank, open assessment of the young, and Daniel, the older one, studied him with a particular solemn intensity that Graham recognized as the look of a boy who had recently been assigned the invisible job of protecting his mother and was not sure he was big enough for it. "This is Mr. Slater," Caroline said to them. "He helped us at the courthouse this morning." "Are you going to help Mama keep our house?" Me asked, with the blunt directness of a 5-year-old. Graham pulled up a chair and sat down so he was not towering over them. "I am doing my best," he said honestly. Me seemed to find this acceptable. She leaned back against her mother. Daniel did not look away. "My father kept everything written down," he said, "in the tin." "I know," Graham said. "Your mother showed me." "Papa always said that a man's word and his paper should say the same thing," Daniel said. He said if a man's word and his paper didn't match, then the man was lying. Graham held the boy's gaze. Your father was right. That evening, with the children in bed and the boarding house quiet, Caroline spread the contents of the tobacco tin on the table in Mrs. Pruitt's kitchen, and Graham sat across from her, and they went through every document together. There was the original loan agreement in Thomas Boone's hand, the interest rate clearly written as 6%. There was the partial repayment from July 1881, which reduced the principal by a third. There was Thomas's letter to Whitmore from February 1882, disputing an updated statement that had arrived claiming double the interest. And there was Whitmore's reply, a brief, cold letter that dismissed Thomas's dispute without addressing the discrepancy. He didn't even try to explain it, Caroline said, holding Whitmore's letter up in the lamp light. Because he knew Thomas couldn't afford to fight it, he just expected Thomas to roll over. He expected Thomas to die, Graham said quietly, and immediately regretted the bluntness of it, but Caroline did not flinch. Yes, she said, he probably did. They were quiet for a moment, the lamp between them casting everything in soft amber. Outside, a dog barked somewhere down the street and then went silent. Gus Farrow will testify that Whitmore has done this before, Graham said. It's not proof that he changed your husband's agreement specifically, but it establishes a pattern. Combined with your original documents and the letter, it might be enough to give the judge pause. It needs to be more than pause, Caroline said. Whitmore's lawyer is good. He is. But judges in this territory don't like having their district associated with fraud. Judge Crane has a reputation he's proud of. Graham looked at her across the table. You need to tell your story clearly and without flinching. Not angrily, just clearly. I am not an angry woman, Caroline said, and there was something rueful in it, almost humor. No, Graham said. You're something more formidable than angry. She looked at him, surprised by the directness of it. He did not elaborate, just looked at the documents again. But the back of his neck was warm, and he was very aware of the fact that he was sitting 3 feet away from a woman who had impressed him more in one day than most people managed in a year. The next morning, Graham rode out to speak to 2 other men in the county. A farmer named Dexter, who had sold his land to Whitmore under pressure 7 years back, and a former ranch hand named Perry, who claimed to have witnessed Whitmore's bookkeeper altering figures on at least one occasion. Dexter would not talk. He had a family and was afraid. But Perry, who had since moved on to a ranch 20 miles south and had nothing to lose, agreed to come in for the hearing. Graham rode back into Caldwell Creek in the late afternoon with Perry riding alongside him, a weathered man of about 45 with a dry sense of humor, and a grudge against Earl Whitmore that had been simmering for the better part of a decade. They stabled their horses at the livery, and Graham went to find Caroline to tell her what he had arranged. He found her at the edge of town, standing at the fence of a small pasture where someone had agreed to board Chester the mule for the days she was in town. She was feeding the mule a handful of dried corn from her pocket, and Chester was accepting it with the majestic indifference of a creature that considered itself far above gratitude. Graham stopped a few feet away, not wanting to interrupt. There was something about the moment, the late afternoon light lying gold across her dark hair, the tiredness in her shoulders softening in the presence of the animal, the way she murmured something quiet to Chester that was not meant for any human ear, that made the breath in his chest do something it hadn't done in a very long time. He had been alone a good while. He had told himself, on the long rides between one ranch and another, that he preferred it that way, that the freedom of the open land suited him, that he was not the kind of man who was built for roots. He had believed all of that entirely, right up until this moment, watching Caroline Boone feed a mule in the afternoon light and understanding, with a clarity that was almost inconvenient, that he had been wrong. I found another witness, he said, and she turned. Her expression when she looked at him had changed slightly from the day before. Still guarded, still careful, but the distance in it was a fraction smaller. Who? He told her about Perry. She listened, and when he was done, she was quiet for a moment. Why are you doing this? She asked, Not suspiciously, just genuinely. Graham thought about it. He was honest by nature and did not like to dress a simple thing in complicated words. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said first, because that was true. Then, because she was looking at him steadily and deserved a fuller answer, he added, "And because you remind me that there are still people in this world who believe that the truth ought to be enough. I'd like to help make sure it is." Caroline looked at him for a long moment. The mule pressed his head against her shoulder and she absently stroked his nose. "Thomas used to say that the worst part about injustice wasn't the harm it did," she said slowly. "It was the way it made honest people feel foolish for having been honest. Your husband sounds like he was a wise man." "He was a good man," Caroline said, and her voice was steady, but her eyes went soft for a moment, the way they did when grief came calling, but she had decided not to let it in all the way. "Not always the smartest about business, but good. He trusted people the way you should be able to trust people." Graham said nothing. He understood that some silences were more respectful than words. After a moment, Caroline straightened her shoulders in that way she had, the one that was not so much pride as simple resolve, and said, "Tell me everything you know about Judge Crane." They walked back toward the boarding house together in the last of the evening light, and Graham told her what he knew about Crane, a circuit judge out of San Angelo who had been on the bench for 12 years and who had a son who had lost a land claim in a similar dispute in another county and had left the territory in disgust. He was not a man who was fond of land sharks, and he was known for listening carefully to original documents. "He will listen," Graham said. "You just have to make sure he hears." "I can do that," Caroline said. He believed her entirely. That night at supper at Mrs. Pruitt's table, with Perry and Graham and Mrs. Pruitt herself and the two children all gathered, there was a warmth to the evening that surprised Caroline. Mee had decided that she liked Perry because he made a sound like a horse when asked to, and Daniel had engaged Graham in a quiet conversation about cattle driving that had clearly been going on for some time by the time the food reached the table. Mrs. Pruitt was the kind of woman who could make a meal feel like a celebration, and she had made a beef stew that smelled like everything warm in the world. Caroline sat at the table and looked around at these people who had come into her crisis like weather, unexpected and in various ways necessary, and felt something in her chest that was not quite hope yet, but was the ground from which hope grew. She caught Graham's eye across the table, and he gave her a look that said nothing in particular and everything that mattered, and she looked away because the alternative was to sit there and feel things she was not ready to examine. She was a widow of 6 weeks. She was in the middle of fighting for her children's home. She had no business feeling anything other than determination and exhaustion, and she knew it. She also knew, because she had always been honest with herself, that knowing something and feeling something were two different processes, and they did not always keep the same schedule. The morning of the hearing, Caroline dressed in the best of what she had brought, a dark blue dress that she had worn to church in better times, pressed as well as she could manage in a boarding house without a proper iron. She pinned her hair up neatly, not ornately, just with the dignity that the occasion required. She put the tobacco tin under her arm, kissed both children, left them with Mrs. Pruitt, and walked to the courthouse. Graham was waiting on the steps. He had shaved. It changed his face somewhat, made the line of his jaw cleaner, and brought out the kind of looks that a man with his bone structure carried without knowing it. He had put on a clean shirt, pressed, the same faded blue as before but clearly washed since last she'd seen it, and he had his hat in his hands rather than on his head. He looked at her, and something in his expression did a thing she had not seen before, a quiet, unguarded appreciation that he did not bother to disguise, followed immediately by a settling back into composure. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds, and she stored it in the same careful back part of her mind, where she was storing a number of things about Graham Slater. "This is inside," he said. "Perry too, they both know what to say." "Thank you," she said. "How are you feeling?" She considered the question with the same seriousness she gave everything. "Like I'm about to walk into a room where a man with more money and more connections than me is going to try to take away everything my husband worked for," she said, and like I'm not going to let him." Graham looked at her in that even, weathered way he had. "Good," he said. "That's exactly right." They went in together. The hearing room on the second floor of the Caldwell Creek Courthouse was a modest space. 12 rows of wooden benches, a raised platform with a judge's desk, 2 tables for the parties, and windows that looked out over the main street. It was already half full when Caroline and Graham arrived, because nothing brought a small town together quite like a public legal dispute involving land, money, and a widow. Earl Whitmore was already seated at his table, a heavy-set man in his mid-50s with the particular self-satisfaction of a man who had never lost anything in his life that he hadn't chosen to let go. He wore a good suit and new boots, and beside him sat Beaumont, his lawyer from San Angelo, who was thin and sharp-featured, and had the air of a man who had been solving problems for men like Whitmore for so long that he had forgotten they were problems worth solving differently. Whitmore looked at Caroline when she came in. He looked at Graham behind her. He looked at Gus Farrow and Perry, and something shifted in his expression, a slight recalibration, the way a man adjusted when the situation was not quite as easy as he had expected. Graham noted the recalibration. He filed it under, "We are doing the right things." Judge Crane arrived at 10 in the morning on the dot, a compact man in his mid-60s with a white beard trimmed short and eyes that had the particular quality of having seen a great deal and been fooled by very little. He took his seat, arranged his papers, looked out over the room with the efficiency of a man who had hearings to complete, and called the matter of Whitmore versus the estate of Thomas Boone. Beaumont went first, as was his right. He was polished and smooth, presenting Whitmore's copy of the loan agreement interest rate clearly printed at 12%, and laying out the mathematics of default with the practiced ease of a man who had done this many times. He produced a signed affidavit from Whitmore's bookkeeper confirming the terms. He produced 3 years of statements sent to the Boone homestead, all reflecting the 12% rate. He spoke with confidence and without waste, and when he sat down, the room felt slightly tilted in Whitmore's direction. Caroline stood. She had no lawyer. She had her tin and her papers and herself. She addressed Judge Crane directly, without theater and without apology. She laid Thomas's original loan agreement on the table and held up her copy, the 6%, clearly written in the same hand that had written everything else in the tobacco tin, the careful hand of a man who had written things down, because he believed that words on paper were a form of honesty. She produced the partial repayment receipt, which reduced the outstanding principal. She produced Thomas's letter disputing the changed figures, and she read from it aloud in a voice that was clear and did not shake. Then she produced Whitmore's reply, the dismissive one that had not addressed the discrepancy. "If the terms had always been 12%, she said, looking directly at Judge Crane, "my husband would have had nothing to dispute in February of 1882. This letter, Earl Whitmore's own letter, confirms that he received a dispute from Thomas Boone about the interest terms. He chose not to answer the dispute on its merits. He simply dismissed it. And 6 months later, my husband was dead, and Mr. Whitmore is here with a revised copy of the agreement that says 12%. She sat down. The room was very quiet. Then Gus Farrow took the stand, and in the dry and factual voice of a man who had spent his life dealing in specifics, described 2 previous cases he had witnessed personally in which Earl Whitmore had presented loan terms to borrowers at one rate at signing and later produced documents claiming higher rates. He named names and dates. He did not embellish. He simply told what he had seen. Beaumont objected 3 times. Judge Crane overruled him each time. Perry testified next about the occasion he had witnessed in Whitmore's office, when the bookkeeper had been making changes to a ledger page, while Whitmore stood over his shoulder giving instructions. And though Perry could not say definitively what was being changed, the detail of his account and the specificity of his memory were the kind of thing that was difficult to fabricate. Beaumont cross-examined both witnesses with considerable skill. He planted seeds of doubt about Gus's age and memory and Perry's motive. The doubt seeds were real. Caroline felt them taking root in the room. Then Whitmore himself took the stand to reiterate that the terms had always been 12%, and that Thomas Boone had simply refused to accept the reality of his debt. And then Judge Crane asked a question. He asked Whitmore, in the mild and specific way of a man who had been carefully listening, why his copy of the loan agreement was printed while Thomas Boone's copy was in handwriting. The room went still. Whitmore said the printer had been used for the official copy, and that Thomas had simply written out his own version. Judge Crane said that in his experience, when two parties signed a loan agreement, both parties signed the same document and asked to see the signature page of Whitmore's printed copy. The signature page showed Thomas Boone's signature. It also showed the paper to be of a slightly different weight and shade than the preceding pages. Judge Crane looked at both documents for a long time without speaking. He then said, calmly and without drama, that in his considered view, the preponderance of evidence, the original handwritten agreement, the dispute letter, the pattern of behavior established by earlier witnesses, and the notable inconsistency in the physical makeup of the document being presented by the claimant, was sufficient to find in favor of the estate of Thomas Boone. He found the loan agreement in Caroline's possession to be the original and binding document. He ruled that the debt, under the correctly established terms, had been substantially paid down by the 1881 repayment, and that the remaining balance, at 6%, properly calculated, was considerably less than what remained of the property's equity. He ruled that the homestead was Caroline Boone's. He also said, with the particular dryness of a judge who had seen a great deal, that the county land office would be receiving a copy of the proceedings for review, and that he was forwarding his notes on the matter to the district attorney's office in San Angelo. Whitmore sat very still and said nothing. Beaumont closed his case files with a snap. Caroline stood at her table with her hands flat on the surface and breathed. Graham was in the second row behind her. She did not look at him. She looked at the judge's bench, at the seal of the state of Texas mounted on the wall above it, at the rectangle of blue Texas sky visible through the window, and she breathed. The courthouse began to empty with the particular noise of a crowd released from attention, and Mrs. Prout appeared from somewhere in the back rows and came forward and took Caroline's hands in both of hers and said nothing, just held them, and Caroline gripped back. Eventually she looked around, and Graham was standing a few feet away with his hat in his hands, watching her with an expression that was not triumph or satisfaction, but something quieter and more genuine, the expression of a man who was glad, simply and entirely glad, that she had won. She crossed the space between them. She did not know what she intended to say. Something adequate to the occasion, something that captured what had happened and what it meant and what he had done to help make it happen. But when she reached him and saw his face up close, all the prepared words scattered. "You said my word would be enough," she said, and her voice was not entirely steady. "I said it was enough," Graham said quietly. "The judge agreed with me." Caroline laughed, unexpected and real, a laugh that surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise him. It was a good laugh, full-bodied and warm, the kind that a person made when the relief was large enough to come out sideways as joy. Graham smiled, and it changed his face in a way that she was entirely unprepared for. She recovered herself, straightened her shoulders, pressed the tobacco tin against her chest. "I have to go tell my children," she said. "Of course." "Mr. Slater, Graham," he said. She looked at him. "Graham." His name in her mouth felt different than she expected, like something that had always been there waiting to be said. "I would like that is, would you come to supper tonight? At the boarding house. I know Mrs. Prout will make something, and I would like to properly thank you and Gus and Perry together." "I'll be there," he said simply. She nodded and turned and walked toward the door, and she did not look back, but she was smiling, and the smile stayed on her face all the way down the courthouse steps and onto the main street of Caldwell Creek, and it was still there when she came through the boarding house door and knelt down and gathered Daniel and me into her arms and told them they were going home. That evening's supper was one of those rare occasions that seem larger than themselves, when a collection of people who have been through something together sit down and eat and breathe and laugh, and the ordinary meal is made something more by what preceded it. Mrs. Prude had cooked a roast, and there was cornbread, and Gus Farrow drank 2 glasses of whiskey and told stories about early Caldwell Creek that were by turns outrageous and touching, and Perry laughed at all of them with the ease of a man who had done a good thing and was at peace with it. Daniel sat beside Graham without being asked to, and peppered him with questions about cattle driving and horse breaking, and whether he had ever been to Fort Worth, and whether Fort Worth was as large as people said it was. Graham answered each question with the same patient seriousness he gave to adult questions, and Caroline watched from across the table and felt the smile find her face again. Me fell asleep at the table midway through dessert, leaning against her mother's arm with a piece of pie still half-eaten on her plate. Later, after the children were in bed and Gus had departed, and Perry had retired to his room, Graham helped Caroline carry the last of the supper things to Mrs. Prude's kitchen. Mrs. Prude herself had tactfully found something to do in the other room. In the kitchen, with the lamp burning low and the dishes stacked between them and the whole enormous day settling into the quiet of its aftermath, Caroline said, "Where do you go from here?" Graham looked at the lamp. "I've got work lined up at the Halford Ranch about 30 miles west. 2 weeks of fence work, then they need help with their fall drive. And after that," he was quiet for a moment. "After that I don't generally know," he said. "That's how it usually goes." "Do you like it that way?" The question was genuine, not pointed. She was a woman who asked what she meant to ask. Graham thought about it honestly. "I used to," he said. "Or I thought I did. The road is good company when you don't have anything better." He looked at her then, and the lamplight was between them, and there was no pretense in either of their faces. "I'm finding I might be tired of the road." Caroline did not look away from him. She was a widow of 6 weeks, and she had just saved her homestead and her children's future, and she was not in a position to be reckless. She also knew her own heart, which had always been honest, and her heart was telling her something that was not convenient but was very clear. "You are welcome on the Boone homestead," she said carefully, "any time you are passing through the county. If you want a meal and a warm place for your horse, it is there." "I might take you up on that more than occasionally," Graham said. "That would be all right," she said. The words were plain. The meaning between them was not. He left the next morning for the Halford Ranch, and Caroline took her children home on the wagon she had borrowed from Mrs. Prude's neighbor, with Chester the mule hitched at the back and the tobacco tin on the bench beside her, and the autumn sky stretching wide and blue over the Texas land. And she felt, for the first time since Thomas had gotten sick, like the world might be something she could hold on to. The Boone homestead was 40 acres on the eastern slope of a ridge that caught the afternoon light in a way that made the dry grass go copper and gold. The house was small, 2 rooms and a lean-to kitchen, built from timber Thomas had felled himself the first year they were there. The half-built barn stood like a question at the edge of the yard, begun in the spring before the fever took Thomas, waiting for someone to answer it. In the weeks that followed the hearing, Caroline threw herself into the work of the place with a focus that was partly necessity and partly the good medicine of useful labor. She had 2 fields to get ready for winter, a roof section that had developed a leak over the summer and not been fixed, and the barn that needed finishing before the cold came in if she was going to have anywhere proper to keep Chester, and the 2 goats she had traded a bolt of cloth to a neighbor for. She was not without help. Several families in the county, people who had watched the Whitmore situation with the tight private sympathy of people who understood what it meant to be vulnerable in a land where power did what it liked, came by with small offerings. A man named Hartwell spent a Saturday helping her fix the roof. The minister and 2 other men from the congregation came out and spent an afternoon on the barn foundation. It was not enough and it was not fast, but it was something, and Caroline accepted it with genuine gratitude and made sure she wrote down every kindness in the same way Thomas had written down every debt. She thought about Graham Slater more than she intended to. Not with the soft, unfocused ache of missing, but with a particular precise quality, the way you thought about someone whose presence had clarified something for you and whose absence was therefore notable. She thought about the way he had stood beside her on those courthouse steps without making a ceremony of it. She thought about his voice when he had answered Daniel's questions, patient and real. She thought about the lamplight in Mrs. Pruitt's kitchen and the particular honesty with which he had said that he was tired of the road. She did not permit herself to think too long about any of it, because there was work to be done, and the work was what kept the homestead standing. 3 weeks after the hearing, on a Saturday morning when the first edge of real cold had come into the air and the grass was stiff with early frost, Caroline heard a horse on the road and looked up from the fence post. She was resetting to see Graham Slater coming up the track. He was on a bay horse she hadn't seen before, a good-looking animal, well-muscled, with an easy stride that spoke of a rider who knew how to handle a horse without fighting it. He had his gear rolled behind the saddle and his hat brim pulled against the morning wind. He looked exactly like himself. Caroline set down the fence post tool and waited. He pulled up a few yards from her and looked at the property with the assessing eye of a man who understood land and labor. He took in the fixed roof, the work on the barn frame, the cleared field to the south. He looked at her, standing in the frost in her work clothes with her hair coming loose from its braid, and he seemed very glad to be where he was. "Halford let me go a week early," he said. "Fall drive finished quicker than expected." "Did it?" she said. "I found myself in the area." "You did," she said. "Your barn needs finishing," he observed. "It does." He looked at her. "I know how to finish a barn." The morning light was pale gold, and the frost sparkled in the grass in Chester. The mule observed all of this from inside the fence with the philosophical detachment of an animal that had been through a great deal and found it all largely equivalent. "There's coffee on," Caroline said. Graham dismounted. He stayed 3 days that first time, working from first light until the last of the usable daylight, and by the time he left, the barn was framed, sided on 3 walls and half-roofed. Daniel followed him like a shadow the entire time, handing up boards and asking questions, and occasionally trying to drive a nail with a confidence that his small arms had not yet fully earned. Graham corrected him without impatience and praised him when he got it right, and watching them together, Caroline felt something in her chest that was not grief and not longing but a simpler and more direct kind of feeling, the kind that said, "This is good." She made him a proper supper each evening, and they sat at the kitchen table after the children were asleep, talking in the unhurried way of 2 people who had decided to be honest with each other and found it suited them. He told her about the years after he left home at 16, drifting through Kansas and Indian Territory and eventually into Texas, learning the work of the land from a series of ranchers who ranged from harsh to generous, accumulating the skills that kept him employed and the independence that kept him moving. He spoke without bitterness about any of it, but she heard the loneliness underneath, the particular loneliness of a life that had never quite settled anywhere. She told him about growing up in Missouri, about her father who had been a school teacher and her mother who had been the most pragmatic woman she had ever known, about meeting Thomas Boone at a church social when she was 20 and finding in him a kind of steadiness that she had wanted to build a life on. She told him about the move to Texas, the hope of it, the hard work of it, the way the land got into you whether you wanted it to or not until you couldn't imagine being elsewhere. She told him about the fever, the way it had come on fast and taken Thomas in 11 days, the way the children had not fully understood and then slowly had, and the way she had found the deposit notice from Whitmore in the post the same week she was still sorting Thomas's clothes. She did not cry telling any of it, not because she had no tears, but because she had cried in private and was not going to waste the limited resource of this conversation on something she had already processed. Graham listened the way he did everything completely, without hurry, with the full weight of his attention. On the morning of his third day, after breakfast and after the children had gone to do their morning chores, he was standing at the door with his hat in his hands and his horse saddled in the yard, and he said, "I'll be back, if that's all right with you." "It's more than all right," Caroline said, and then, because she was not a woman who had ever been good at pretending, she said, "I find I look forward to it considerably." He looked at her with those steady oak-brown eyes that she had come to trust completely. "I'll be back in 3 weeks," he said. "I've got work in Abilene, but it won't take long." "We'll be here," she said. He nodded. He put his hat on. He paused for just a moment in the doorway, and she was standing very close, and for just that moment neither of them moved. Then Daniel came around the corner of the house, calling out that Chester had gotten into the feed bucket again, and the moment ended, and Graham smiled and stepped out and went to help with Chester, and Caroline leaned against the doorframe and pressed her fingers over her mouth and felt the whole complicated geography of her heart. He came back in 3 weeks as he had said, and then again 3 weeks after that, and by the time December arrived and the cold was genuinely in the ground, and the barn was fully finished and secure, the rhythm of his coming and going had woven itself into the fabric of the homestead in a way that Daniel and me had accepted as simply natural, the way children accepted things that worked. Me had taken to calling him Mr. Graham, which was neither entirely formal nor entirely familiar, but sat comfortably between the two. Daniel had taken to the quiet and direct approach of simply being wherever Graham was, absorbing everything Graham did, and said with the intense focus of a boy choosing the architecture of who he wanted to become. On a cold December afternoon, when the work was done, and the children were occupied with a spelling lesson Caroline had assigned them at the kitchen table, Graham and Caroline stood at the fence at the edge of the south field and looked out at the land in its winter rest. The sky was the pale gray-blue of winter, and the ridge to the east was dark against it, and the homestead sat in the middle distance behind them, small and solid and present. "I want to ask you something," Graham said. Caroline turned to look at him. There was no surprise in her. She had known something was coming because she had known him long enough to read the particular quality of his silences. "Go ahead," she said. He turned to face her fully, hat in hand, the winter wind moving through his hair. He was not nervous in the way some men were nervous with fidgeting and avoidance, but there was a gravity to him that was clearly the gravity of someone who was about to say something that mattered completely. "I know it's soon," he said. "I know you are still finding your footing, and I am not a man with a great deal to offer in the way of settled property or a name that carries weight in this county. What I have is the truth, and the truth is that I have not thought about the road once since October. The truth is that every time I ride back here, this land and this family feel more like where I am supposed to be than anywhere I have been in my life." He paused. "The truth is that I am in love with you, Caroline. And I would like, if you are willing, to spend the rest of my life earning the right to call this home." The winter afternoon held them both in its quiet. The bare branches of the oak tree at the fence line moved faintly in the wind. Chester appeared at the far end of the pasture and regarded them both with the same philosophical expression he brought to everything. Caroline looked at Graham Slater and did not pretend to consider when she had already considered thoroughly over the past months in the particular honest way she considered everything. "I love you too," she said. "I have been aware of it for some time and have not known what to do about it, partly because the timing seemed wrong and partly because I did not want to be wrong about you." She met his eyes directly. "I am not wrong about you." He took one step forward, and then she was in his arms, and he held her with a care and a completeness that was both new and entirely right. And she pressed her face against the front of his coat and breathed him in and felt the hard several months of holding everything together by herself loosen their grip slightly, like a fist that had been clenched so long it had forgotten how to open. He held her there in the cold December afternoon for a long time, and neither of them said anything, and that was exactly correct. They were married in March of 1883. The wedding was held at the Caldwell Creek Church on a bright, cool morning when the first wildflowers were just coming up through the grass on the ridge. Mrs. Prout came, and Gus Farrow came, looking considerably more jovial than his usual self, and several families from the county who had come to respect Caroline over the previous months filled the pews with their Sunday clothes and their goodwill. Daniel stood beside Graham as a kind of informal best man, serious and proud in the way of a boy who understands that something important is happening and intends to do his part correctly. Me stood beside her mother and held a small bunch of the early wildflowers that she had gathered herself that morning, pressing them against her nose periodically as if to confirm they were still there. Caroline wore the blue dress again, the good one from the hearing, because she did not have the means for a new one, and the blue dress had already proven itself at the most important moment of the previous year, and she saw no reason to retire it now. She had pressed it carefully and put a small piece of lace at the collar that had been her mother's, and she had let her hair down and pinned it partly back with the bone comb that Thomas had given her on their first anniversary, because she believed in honoring what had been even as you moved toward what was to come. Graham, when he saw her come down the aisle, went entirely still in the way a man went still when the world did something better than he had believed the world was capable of. The minister said the words, and they said the words back, and when it came to the part about a man being worthy of trust, Graham looked at Caroline with an expression that was not performance but simply true, and she returned it in kind. After the ceremony, there was food at the boarding house. Mrs. Prout had organized it with her characteristic efficiency, and there was music from a fiddle player named Cal who had a gift for making even a small gathering feel like a celebration. Me danced in the middle of the floor with an unself-consciousness that made everyone who saw it smile. Daniel tried to dance and decided that dignity required he stop, and Graham clapped him on the shoulder and told him that some things improved with practice, and Daniel decided this was probably true. Graham pulled Caroline into a dance that neither of them was particularly skilled at, but that they were both entirely willing to be unskilled at together, and she laughed the same full genuine laugh she had laughed on the courthouse steps, and he spun her once in the small cleared space and felt like a man who had come a very long way to arrive somewhere completely right. In the spring that followed the wedding, Graham put his full energy into the homestead. He was not a man of half measures. When he was in entirely, and the 40 acres of the Boone homestead began to show what they could do when worked by two people who both understood land and labor and commitment. He got the south field fully turned and planted, and he replaced the fence line on the east side that had been letting Hartwell's cattle wander over, and he built a proper smokehouse at the back of the barn, because Caroline had been curing meat by makeshift methods for 3 years and deserved better. He was also a natural father in the particular way that men sometimes were who had been paying close attention their whole lives without knowing what they were storing it up for. With Daniel, there was the easy companionship of a man and a boy who understood each other, practical, direct, generous. With me, he was something different, softer around the edges, the way a man who had never had anything delicate in his care became when he finally did. Me would come and sit beside him of an evening and tell him whatever was in her head with the absolute confidence that he would find it interesting, and he always did. Thomas Boone was not forgotten. Caroline made sure of that, not with grief that clouded the present, but with the honest acknowledgement that a man had lived and mattered. The tobacco tin stayed on the mantelpiece. The children knew their father's stories. When Daniel asked Graham once if it was strange that he had 2 fathers, Graham considered it for a moment and then said that it meant Daniel was lucky twice. And Daniel, after thinking about this carefully, agreed that it did seem like good mathematics. In the summer of 1883, Caroline found herself expecting a child. She told Graham on a warm evening when the fireflies were just beginning to show in the long grass at the edge of the yard, sitting on the porch steps with her shoulder against his arm. She said it quietly, just a simple statement of fact, and then she waited. Graham put his arm around her and pulled her close against his side and looked out at the fireflies for a long time. "Are you happy?" she asked eventually, because she was a woman who asked what she wanted to know. "I don't have a word large enough for what I am," he said, and his voice was rough with it. She leaned her head against his shoulder and felt the sum of the last year, the courthouse steps and the lamplit kitchen and the December fence line and the blue dress, and the dancing settle into something that was not a list of events but a single continuous truth. The child was born in January of 1884, on a night when the snow came down out of the north and covered the Texas ridge in white. The birth was hard but not dangerous, attended by the county midwife and Mrs. Prout, who had driven 20 miles in the snow because Caroline had asked her to. Graham spent the hours of the labor sitting in the kitchen with the children, keeping them calm with stories and warm drinks, and when the midwife called him in, he came through the door and saw Caroline holding the baby against her chest with the terrible and brilliant exhaustion of a woman who had just done the most enormous thing, and he crossed the room and knelt at the bedside. The baby was a boy. He was red-faced and loudly displeased with the world in the manner of newborns. "He looks like he has opinions," Graham said. Caroline laughed weakly. "He's a Slater," she said. "Of course he has opinions." They named him Henry Thomas Slater, the Thomas for the man who had first broken this ground and whose tin of documents had saved the family's future. The Henry because Graham's grandfather had been a man named Henry who had come to Texas before the war, and whom Graham had spoken of, with a particular quiet respect that told Caroline he had loved him. Henry proved to have opinions about everything, and a determination that aged rapidly from newborn fury into toddler persistence, into the kind of small boy single-mindedness that kept his parents in a state of perpetual amused exhaustion. He was also demonstrably his mother's son in the matter of the chin, and his father's son in the matter of the eyes. And the combination was entirely devastating, in the way that the combinations of good people often were. Daniel took to his baby brother with the protective seriousness he brought to all his responsibilities, and me took to him with a warmth that was a miniature version of Caroline's own, and the house on the 40 acres of the Boone Slater homestead became the particular kind of full that is not crowded but alive. Earl Whitmore, in the wake of the hearing and Judge Crane's referral to the district attorney's office, did not lose his land holdings overnight. Powerful men rarely did, but the light that had been shown on his methods cost him considerably. 2 other landowners who had been subjected to similar practices came forward. A formal investigation was opened by the district attorney's office in San Angelo. Whitmore's lawyer Beaumont, who had a survival instinct common to men of his profession, chose not to be available for further cases involving disputed terms in Whitmore's favor. Within a year, Whitmore had sold off most of his county holdings and relocated his operations to a different part of the territory, taking his particular brand of business with him. Caldwell Creek noted his departure with the particular quiet satisfaction of a town that had watched something wrong go on for too long and had finally seen it end. Gus Farrow, who had come out of the hearing with something that looked remarkably like peace, lived another 4 years. He came to supper at the Slater homestead twice a year for every one of those years, and he always brought peppermint sticks for the children and told stories that were slightly more colorful than entirely accurate, and everyone loved him for both the stories and the peppermint sticks equally. Perry, the ranch hand who had testified, went back to his work 20 miles south and sent a note to Caroline the following spring that said simply, "Heard Whitmore's pulling out. Thought you'd want to know." She had written back, "Thank you, Perry, for everything. The world is more honest for it." He had written back, "It was time somebody made it so." The seasons on the homestead moved the way seasons did on working land. Not gently, not always fairly, but with the cumulative rightness of effort and weather and growth and harvest and rest and growth again. There was a bad year in 1885 when the summer dried hard and the South Field gave less than half what it should have, and they tightened their belts, and Graham took on contract work at the Halford Ranch for 2 months to bridge the gap. And when he came home, Caroline had already figured out 3 ways to stretch what they had, and they sat together at the kitchen table in the late August heat and worked through the numbers and came out the other side of it intact, which felt like its own particular victory. There was a good year in 1886 when the rains came right and both fields produced, and Graham traded 2 horses he had broken for a team of oxen that made the deep plowing significantly less backbreaking. And Caroline planted a kitchen garden that summer that was so productive she began trading surplus produce with 3 neighboring families for things they needed. And the kitchen garden became, in subsequent years, a reliable secondary economy that she was genuinely proud of. Daniel, by 1886, was 12 years old and as capable on the homestead as a man twice his age. With Thomas's methodical nature and Caroline's practical intelligence, and a quiet resolve that was entirely his own. He had also inherited, somewhere along the way, Graham's love of horses, and Graham had begun seriously teaching him horsemanship in the spare hours, taking him out on the open land beyond the ridge, and teaching him to read an animal the way you read a person, through patience and attention, and the willingness to move at their pace before you asked them to move at yours. Me, at 10, was a different creature altogether, quicker, more verbal, more interested in the world of people than the world of animals, with a gift for arithmetic that had surfaced in her second year of the school that Caldwell Creek had managed to establish in 1884, and which she had been attending with the kind of focused intent that her teacher, a young woman named Miss Aldrich, described in her quarterly notes home as exceptional. Caroline had smiled at that report and put it in the tobacco tin, beside Thomas's papers, because some things deserved to be kept. Henry, at 2 in 1886, was a force of nature in miniature, with Graham's build already evident in the width of his shoulders and Caroline's eyes, and an absolute certainty about his own opinions that made family mealtimes a lively negotiation. On a Saturday evening in October of 1886, when the harvest was in and the work had slowed to the maintenance pace of autumn and the children were in bed, Graham and Caroline sat on the porch in the cold evening air with wool blankets around their shoulders and mugs of coffee in their hands and looked out at the 40 acres in the last of the October moonlight. "Do you remember the courthouse steps?" Caroline said. Graham turned to look at her. "I remember everything about that morning," he said. She smiled, and it was the smile that had been on her face going down the courthouse steps 3 years ago, warm and real, and arrived at through real difficulty, which is the best kind of smile. "I was so determined not to need help," she said. "You didn't need it," Graham said. "You had everything you needed. You just needed someone to stand beside you while you used it." "That is a very precise distinction," she said. "It's a true one," he said. "You walked into that courtroom and you faced that judge and you laid it out plain and you won. I didn't do that. You did." "You found Gus and Perry," she said. "I asked around," he said. "You would have found them too, given another day. I just had more time to spend asking." She looked at him in the moonlight. He was 36 years old now, the angles of his face a little more settled, a few more lines at the corners of those oak-brown eyes, and he was the most familiar and the most honest presence in her life, and she loved him in the simple and total way that she had come to understand, was the right kind of love, not dependent on drama or distance or longing, but built on the same thing the homestead was built on, consistent presence and honest work, and the willingness to be in it through the seasons. "You said my word was enough," she said quietly. He took her hand from around her coffee mug and held it in his, the roughness of his palm against the roughness of hers, 2 working people in the moonlight. "It was always enough," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and the night settled around them, and the homestead was quiet and whole. In the years that followed, Caldwell Creek grew the way small towns in the territory grew in that decade, not rapidly, but steadily, acquiring a newspaper, a telegraph office, a second church, a larger school. The Slater homestead grew with it, in the slow accumulative way of land that was cared for a second water trough, a proper root cellar, a second bedroom added onto the house in 1887 that was Henry's by right of having declared with considerable passion that he needed his own room, a claim that Daniel and me supported with the enthusiastic solidarity of older siblings who had been sharing with a toddler for 3 years. In 1888, Caroline found herself expecting again. She told Graham in the kitchen in the early morning of a May day, and this time he was ready. He put down his coffee cup and pulled her close and held her right there in the kitchen with the sunrise coming through the window and the sound of the children beginning to stir upstairs. "This one is going to be a girl," he said with complete confidence. "You don't know that," she said into his shoulder. "I know it," he said. "Their daughter was born in December of 1888. They named her Clara Jane Slater." She had Caroline's dark hair and Graham's steady eyes, and it became apparent within the first few days, the opinion-having nature of her brother Henry, which in a girl manifested with a directness that even at newborn seemed intentional. Henry was 4 years old and greeted his baby sister with the solemnity of a child assigning himself an important role. He held her on his lap under careful supervision and studied her with an expression of concentrated interest that made everyone in the room laugh quietly. "She looks like she knows things," he said. "She just arrived," Daniel pointed out. "She still looks like she knows things," Henry insisted. He was not wrong. Clara grew into a bright, bold girl who was nobody's shadow, who would follow Daniel to the horses, and me to her arithmetic books, and Henry into whatever scheme he was currently pursuing, absorbing it all and then pursuing her own directions entirely. She was the one who would later insist on attending the new school in San Angelo, who would correspond with Miss Aldrich about further education, who would in her own time become someone who made both her parents quietly astonished in the way that children sometimes made their parents astonished, by becoming more fully themselves than anyone had quite anticipated. But that was later. In the autumn of 1889, when Clara was nearly 1 year old and Henry was a noisy and dedicated 5-year-old, and me was 13 and Daniel was 15, and working the homestead like a young man who owned it in his heart if not in deed, Graham and Caroline celebrated their 6th wedding anniversary with the same quality of quiet ceremony they brought to important things. A good supper, a walk in the October evening, the children in bed, the moonlight on the ridge. Graham had carved something for her during the spare hours of the summer, working at the kitchen table in the evenings while she read or mended, a small wooden box made from a piece of black walnut he had found on the creek bank, fitted with a clean brass hinge and a latch that seated perfectly. He had carved a pattern around the lid, the ridge line, the way it looked from the front porch at sunset, the long, low arc of the land they lived on. He put it on the table in front of her after supper. She opened it. Inside, on a small square of folded paper, he had written something in his careful, economical hand. She read it. He had written, "6 years of your word being enough for me, and mine being enough for you, and the land between us full of everything we built. I could spend 60 more and not run out of gratitude." Caroline set the paper down on the table and pressed both hands flat against it and looked at what he had written for a long time. "You are a more eloquent man than you let on," she said. "Don't tell anyone," he said. "I have a reputation." She laughed, and he leaned across the table and kissed her, and the lamp burned between them with its warm, undemanding light, and outside the Texas night was wide and dark and full of stars, and the homestead held its 40 acres under the dark sky, solid and present and entirely theirs. The tobacco tin stayed on the mantelpiece. Caroline had added to it over the years the deed with the judge's ruling, the marriage certificate, the children's birth records, the annual harvest tallies in her own neat hand, Daniel's first school report, me's exceptional notation, Henry's drawing of Chester the mule that he had made at age 3 and presented with enormous pride, and in the center of it, the original loan agreement that Thomas Boone had kept with such care, and that had saved them all. The tin was dented in one corner now, and its clasp had been replaced twice, but it held everything it held, and Caroline knew that holding things was its most important quality. Chester the mule was old by 1889, going gray at his muzzle and slower on his feet, but he was still present in the pasture, and still receiving dried corn from Caroline's pocket in the mornings, and still regarding the world with the same magnificent philosophical indifference that had characterized him since birth. He was, Daniel said once, the most consistent creature in the county. Caroline thought this was probably true, and was nothing but a credit to Chester. In the spring of 1890, Daniel was 16, and he told his parents one Sunday evening at supper that he intended to take a position on the Halford Ranch for the summer to earn his own wages, and to save for the possibility of one day purchasing the parcel of land that adjoined the Boone Slater homestead to the north, which had been sitting vacant since its previous owner had moved on to Colorado. Caroline and Graham listened to this proposal, exchanged a look that contained a conversation, and then Graham told Daniel that it was a sound plan and asked several practical questions about wages and timeline. And Caroline told Daniel that she was proud of him and that she expected a letter every 2 weeks if he was staying out at the Halford place. And Daniel, who had Thomas's precise nature and Graham's quiet resolve, and who was clearly going to be very good at whatever he decided to put himself toward, nodded seriously and said he would write me that same spring, announced that she intended to become a teacher, which surprised no one who had spent any time with her and her enthusiasm for the organization of knowledge. Miss Aldrich had written to Caroline directly to say that me had the makings of an extraordinary educator, and that there was a program for teachers' certification in San Angelo that me might wish to consider. Caroline had written back to say that she and her husband would look into what was necessary, and that me would be supported in this. The world in 1890 was moving, as it always was, and the territory was changing: more settlements, more roads, more law, less wilderness. The long, slow domestication of a land that had been wild in ways that were not entirely resolved. Graham watched the changes with the eye of a man who had seen more of the territory than most, and felt the particular complex feeling of someone who loved the open land, and understood that it could not stay open forever in quite the way it had been. But the homestead, on its 40 acres under the ridge, was not wilderness, and it was not merely settled land. It was something that had been made into itself through the particular combination of the people who lived on it, and that combination felt permanent to Graham in a way that very little in his life had ever felt permanent before. He was 39 years old, and he woke up every morning in the same house with the same woman and the same children and the same mule in the same pasture, and the same ridge to the east catching the same morning light. And the constancy of it was not a diminishment of who he was, but the fullest expression of it. He had been afraid of that once. That settling would be a kind of erasure, a closing off. He had been wrong. Settling here with Caroline and the children and the land had not closed anything off. It had opened everything. On a warm June morning in 1890, with the south field standing green in its early summer growth, and Clara toddling after me in the yard and Henry running in circles for reasons best known to himself, Graham was working on the fence at the north edge of the property when he looked up and saw Caroline walking toward him through the long grass, carrying 2 tin cups of coffee, and moving through the morning light with the unhurried ease of a woman who was entirely at home in herself and in her life. She handed him the coffee. They stood together at the fence line and looked north over the vacant parcel that Daniel wanted to buy someday. "It's good land," Graham said. "It is," Caroline said. "With some work it could be very good land." She smiled at the horizon. "Are you making a plan?" "I'm entertaining the possibility of a plan," he said. "Daniel's wages this summer, combined with what we might manage to save from the fall harvest, it would be a start." "It would," she agreed. They stood in the morning light with their coffee and their plans, and the green fields behind them and the empty land ahead of them and the children's voices carrying from the yard, and it was all exactly right. It was not a story without difficulty. There had been difficulty, real and hard, and there would be more, because that was the nature of life on this land in this time, and they were not people who pretended otherwise. But the difficulty had not broken them, and the good had not been diminished by the hard, and the good was very good. The tobacco tin sat on the mantelpiece in the house behind them, holding everything it had always held. The courthouse in Caldwell Creek stood on its limestone foundation on the main street of town, with its windows looking out over the road where a woman had once stood with nothing but her word and a tin of documents and the intention to be honest and right, and where a man had come up the steps beside her and said that was enough. That had been 8 years ago. The word had been enough. The truth had been enough. The stepping beside had led to something larger and more lasting than either of them had imagined standing on those steps in the October morning of 1882, larger than the legal victory and the homestead saved, and the children kept safe in their home, larger than all of that, and built on all of that, built on the same foundation as the house on the ridge and the barn and the root cellar and the kitchen garden, which was the foundation of honest people doing honest work in honest love with each other. Day by day, season by season, year by year, in the wide and beautiful and demanding country of the Texas land. Graham Slater had spent 16 years on the road before he came up those courthouse steps, and he had never looked for the road again. Caroline Boone had stood alone in her grief and her determination on those same steps, and she had not stood alone since. They walked back to the house together through the long green grass of the June morning, and the children called to them from the yard, and the homestead received them, and the door was open.